Raiding has been a core part of World of Warcraft's gameplay since its very first expansions. Throughout the years, especially recent years, if we look at the numbers, the participation in raiding has been going downhill, generally speaking. And our objective for today is to answer the question, why is that happening? So to diagnose the problem, and then, once we establish what the problem is, to offer a potential solution. And I do believe there is a simple solution, which would include actually removing one of the raid's difficulties. Can you guess which? But bear with me as we journey to the conclusion through an analysis. I apologize in advance for my imperfect English skills, but I do intend on reaching not only Polish speakers but WoW player base in general. Because, as you've probably heard, the discussion about raiding itself kicked off again recently in the WoW's community with the whole Asmongold Mike Ibarra situation. Now, while I will not go into deep details of this whole discussion, I will just say that I personally agree with a lot of points that Asmongold is making about raids and things that should change. And the whole issue of WoW's raiding downtime, when you just don't actually play the game, you are waiting, you are just wasting your time because your group doesn't have a warlock to summon and so on. Because while I do agree with most of these points, I do not think they address the core issue. Fixing the downtime when you don't have to wait after every wipe to rebuff and to eat your food and then summon someone because someone left the group and now you have to wait. While I do believe it would improve the raiding experience, perhaps even by a large margin, I do not think it would repair it. I don't think they would address the main issues that cause the decrease in participation of World of Warcraft's raiding. For they exist on a much more fundamental level when it comes to the whole system of raiding in WoW. So first, we need to establish what the problem is by asking a simple question. Why do people raid? Or rather, why would they raid? What is the purpose of doing raid content in WoW? What is the incentive that the game gives for player to make that choice, to invest their time in that part of the game? Now, of course, answering that kind of a question would be very broad and wide, which is why I will segment this question exactly the same way the game segments raiders, so by difficulty level. So let's start from the top, Mythic raiding, the hardest difficulty in WoW's raiding. So why do people raid Mythic in WoW? Well, that actually seems pretty simple. I think it's mostly for the challenge. And challenge it does provide. To be honest, while I do believe that even in Mythic raiding certain things could be improved, I believe the Mythic part of the raiding player base is actually the most stable and solid of them all. It would seem that the thing that the Mythic player base was displeased most about over the years wasn't actually the raiding itself. It weren't the raids itself, the bosses itself. Well, for the most part. Again, there were some ups and downs there, but the Mythic raiding as a whole generally works for them. They were most displeased about things outside of raiding that the game forces them to do other content besides the one they like, because they like the challenge that the Mythic raiding provides. And again, while I do think there could be some changes, there could be some improvements, on a fundamental level, Mythic raiding just works. It works for the people who it is designed for. And by the way, that's one of the things I disagree with Asmongold.
Yeah, remove 2 raid difficulties too. Yep, just have normal and heroic.
I don't think Mythic raiding should be deleted out of the game just because we don't play it, just because it's not content for us or the majority of the player base. I think it has its niche place for the hardcore players, and the fact that it exists doesn't hurt anyone. So I do not think we should delete Mythic. If anything, Mythic should be deleting us. But Mythic is only a certain fraction of the whole player base, even of the raiding player base itself. The real issue, the real problems are down there in the heroic and normal difficulty. And let us again ask the big question. Why do people raid heroic? Why would people decide to raid heroic? What is the incentive? Now, would the answer be the same as Mythic Raiders? Would it be for the challenge itself? Because Heroic, while it is far from being as challenging as Mythic difficulty, does in fact present some degree of a challenge. Albeit it's not the kind of challenge, nowhere near as the kind of challenge as the Mythic raiding provides, it's not exactly just a face roll. But in general, I think we can all agree that Heroic player base is much more intertwined with the normal raiding player base than with the Mythic player base. The difficulty spike between Heroic and Mythic is much higher than from normal compared to Heroic, so the Mythic guys, the Mythic world is much more separated from all the other raiding player base. But again, is challenge itself the main reason, the main goal why do players decide to raid Heroic? Or is it perhaps all the other things, like the rewards that the Heroic raiding provides, the loot, the achievements, the ahead of the curve, not the progression itself, not the fights themselves, but more so the rewards, and all the other things like hanging out with your guild, socializing, and so on. Let me put it this way. If an average Heroic raider would have a choice to get the same rewards that he does from a Heroic raid, but from an easier or more accessible content, which one do you think he would choose? And I might be wrong here, but I think we can all agree that for the most part, not everyone, but most Heroic raiders would choose the latter. They would choose the easier, the more accessible way of getting the rewards instead of raiding, because what really matters are the rewards themselves. And when it comes to this part of the player base that rates Heroic, not Mythic, but Heroic, for the challenge, for the progression, and much less so for the rewards, much less so for the loot and achievements, but just for the raiding itself because they enjoy it, we can go the other way around and just phrase the question this way. If we have a player that is looking for the challenge, for the hardcore challenge because that is what he finds fun, does he choose to raid Heroic? Well, not really, right? Because that's what Mythic is for. Mythic is the challenge. The only players that raid for the challenge and choose Heroic instead of Mythic do it only because they cannot, for whatever reason, raid Mythic, like the time, like the fact that they cannot just commit themselves to be on this regular schedule, like 2 or 3 evenings a week, to just regularly participate in progression of a Mythic guild. But that is the exception. Most people that find the challenge itself fun go to raid Mythic, which further enhances the point that most people that raid Heroic do it not for the challenge itself, because also, let's face it, Heroic is just simply not that hard, at least in the terms of like, you know, progression, raiding few times a week with an organized group on Discord and so on. They do it for all the other things, mainly the rewards. And that, I think, is the key difference between a Mythic Raider and a Heroic Raider. For Heroic Raider, the main objective of the raiding, the main reason he chooses to do that content is not the difficulty itself. Doing the raid is more of a means to an end. Of course, all of this is pretty anecdotal because we simply do not possess that kind of a data that would determine the psychology of an average raider when it comes to Heroic and Mythic, so empirical, anecdotal evidence is really all we've got. But again, as much as a generalization that is, I think most of us can agree that an average Heroic raider doesn't raid Heroic because it is so difficult and he enjoys the high difficulty ceiling of a Heroic raid. I don't think that's the case for the most Heroic players. If a Heroic player appreciates the challenge, I think it's more so that there is any kind of challenge, that you actually have to do something, that you actually have to be in a coordinated group and just do the boss's mechanics, that it's just not a face roll that a raid finder or often normal is. Which brings us to the normal difficulty mode. And that is where the real problem starts. For once again, let us ask the big question. Why the hell would you raid normal? If we look at history of World of Warcraft's raiding as a whole, I think we can identify 3 key points that led to downfall of normal mode. You see, originally, raids in World of Warcraft only had normal difficulty setting. There was just raid and no other difficulty modes. And then in the Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard started to really experiment with the raids because they wanted to make them more accessible to the rest of the player base. Which they originally did with Naxxramas, but then they decided that something's missing for the more hardcore players now. So they added a new difficulty setting for the raids, Heroic, which really was an afterthought of Ulduar's hard modes, but that doesn't matter now. And also not even including the whole 10-man and 25-man raid situation that will be in Wrath of the Lich King and in the next expansions throughout the Cataclysm. What happened with introducing another settings of difficulty of a one raid was a segmentation of a player base between the raid modes, but also differentiating the rewards between them. So putting it simply, whereas originally you had the best loot in the game, absolute epics, from the most basic raid level, which was normal, now you've had best gear from the harder difficulty options, which rendered the gear from normal much less powerful. What really happened was the degradation of rewards of normal difficulty mode. Because in the end, what matters, what defines the power of a reward is how far it has to being the best reward, the most powerful loot and items in the game. And then, few expansions later, in Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard will introduce yet another difficulty setting even higher than Heroic, which was of course Mythic. And again, what really happened, besides further segmentation of player base between even more difficulty modes of a raid, was further degradation of rewards that a normal raid offers. The gear from normal just gotten worse each time Blizzard upped the ceiling with each new difficulty option and new, even better rewards with it. Because again, if the ceiling of the best items in the game is even higher, that renders the loot from normal raid even lower in worth, in power. And then Blizzard introduced something that would prove further down the line to be the final nail in the coffin when it comes to normal raids, and to some extent also heroic raids. The Legion's very own Mythic Plus mode of a dungeon. Now, why would that be? Why would a difficulty setting for a dungeon prove to be a problem for raiding, for a completely separate piece of content? The reason for that is because it actually fulfills the very hypothesis I've described earlier. What would happen if a heroic, or in that case normal raider, would have an option to get the same rewards but from a more accessible content? Based on my assumptions, we've established that he would choose the latter, the more accessible content. And that is exactly what happened with Mythic Plus, with years of that content existing in the game. And that, ladies and gentlemen, leads us to the root of the issue with normal mode. Because realistically, the only reason the game gives you to do a normal raid is the gear. But even that reason is gone when you can get the same gear with much lower effort and less time investment, which is Mythic Plus. Which effectively means that nowadays there is absolutely zero reason to do normal raid. The only reason I can think of actually is for someone to get into WoW's raiding, because the entry threshold to WoW's raiding is pretty high. So normal is kind of a way to just see the raids for the first time, to participate in them, to just be a beginner at raiding. But very soon, once you get the basics, you just move up to heroic. There is no reason to do normal. Maybe perhaps only because you cannot find people to do heroic for some reason. But again, that is due to the fact that the player base is very segmented when it comes to raiders. Which again is largely due to the fact that there are several difficulty options in the game of a raid. There is an occurrence that is, I think, observable in basically every game, that the more easy the content is, the more people engage in it, because by definition, most people are casuals. So it makes sense that more people will be engaged in heroic raiding compared to mythic raiding, because the entry threshold there is higher, because it is just harder. It requires more time investment. And that is exactly what happens. The number of mythic kills is always much lower than the number of heroic kills on a given raid. That seems pretty obvious, right? So, following the same reasoning, you would think that more people kill bosses on normal difficulty, which is easier than the number of kills on heroic difficulty. You would think that, because that would make sense. But then, when you actually look at the numbers, what turns out is that while this disproportion does exist between heroic and mythic, it doesn't really exist between normal and heroic. In many cases, when you actually look at the first bosses, the kills on heroic are actually even higher there than on normal, even though it is harder. Now there is a couple reasons for that. First of all, the heroic guilds often start the raid tier from normal, so in the normal kills we actually have heroic interested guilds who just clear normal for the very first pieces of gear to just move up. And then on the other hand, you do have those strictly raiding normal guilds who actually do clear at least first couple bosses on heroic, because they are similar in difficulty level to the later bosses in normal. There's also the fact that some guilds who start from normal ascend with gear to the heroic, and we will actually come back to it later. So while there are things like that, what is important here to notice is that the disproportion which we talked about between heroic and mythic doesn't exist between normal and heroic, even though it kind of should, because normal is the easier mode, and it doesn't. Now, what those numbers really tell us, I think, is that there would be way more players playing normal raid, who are just choosing not to do that. Why is that? I think it is because there is absolutely zero reason to do normal. There is absolutely no point in doing normal in current version of World of Warcraft. Very large part of people who do normal are actually aiming for heroic, and normal is just like this entry level to start raiding heroic. The game simply doesn't offer any kind of real incentive to do that content for itself. To much larger degree, you have that kind of incentive when it comes to raiding heroic, because the rewards there, while not being the best in the game, are pretty close, are very much closer to being the best in the game than in normals. Whereas gear from normal is absolute garbage. It's trash can. You could say that you do normal for the transmog tint, which comes only from normal, but even then, this is a complete waste of time. It's counterproductive, because with every patch, it will be easier to get that gear, because the raid will get easier. Also, with how Catalyst works in Dragonflight, it is even more pointless. So again, other from minor things like the guild is just used to doing normal because it's a group of friends that just like to chit-chat and joke around while doing something in the background, which basically a normal raid is. Besides from minor things like that, there is absolutely no in-game related reason to do normal. Even looking back, let's think about it. I raided back in the day as well. And let us ask the same question. Why did we raid back then? In my opinion, truth is that a very large portion of us raided not because the raids themselves were so fun and engaging, but because it offered the best rewards. And the game's endgame back then was basically just it. It was raiding and nothing much really else to do, whereas today you have very different things to do in endgame, especially in Dragonflight. For you see, back in the day, back in the, you know, golden age, for doing the basic and, let's be honest, easy mode of the raid, we could get the best gear, and that was the real reason why people were drawn to it. And with time, with every single other difficulty setting that upped the ceiling and the rewards with it, it degraded the rewards worth from normal, which is why nobody really wants to do it anymore. There is just no point. Alright, now that we've established what the problem is, we've kind of diagnosed where it hurts. Now, with that, we can proceed to find a cure, to find a solution to this matter. And believe it or not, I think the solution to this problem is actually pretty simple. What we've established is that the problem is mainly at heroic and normal levels. Whereas in heroic, people mainly do this content because of the rewards, and in normal, the problem is that there is just no real reason to do that, because the real rewards are at heroic and mythic level. And when it comes to heroic, people actually even often complain that heroic is actually too hard. Again, because they are mainly interested in the rewards themselves, not exactly the long-term progression and overall challenge. So the simple solution I offer is the following. Just merge heroic and normal levels into a singular mode, just into one difficulty, by taking the best of each and making it into one. In other words, just delete heroic and make normal maybe a little bit spicier, maybe add a little bit of difficulty there, and make it more rewarding. Make the normal drop the rewards of a heroic level, or even higher actually, maybe even higher up the rewards by a few item levels, so that the disparity between heroic item level, or rather normal item level, and the mythic item level is not so big. Or hell, maybe let's even equalize them. Yeah, you heard that right. Equalize them. Delete heroic and make normal drop the same item level rewards as mythic. And I know it might sound batshit crazy at first glance, but think about it. The main reason to raid Mythic is the challenge itself, is the bragging rights, it's the achievements and so on, not the gear. The gear is a mean to an end, not the end itself. And when it comes to the argument that, yeah, but you know, it's Mythic, it should have the best item level rewards, it should drop the best gear because it's the most challenging mode in the game. Who cares? It gets reset in the next patch anyway, and you will get the same gear way easier from Mythic 20s. Again, the gear in Mythic raiding is much more of a mean to an end. The end itself are the bosses, is the raid itself. Defeating a hard boss is the reward, not the gear. The gear is something that helps you achieve it. And that is something that actually shifts when we consider the lower difficulties, the heroic and normal. And then you just have normal, which is pretty easy and rewards good loot. And you have Mythic if you'd like to do it on a much more challenging level. That's it. On a fundamental level, that's all there is to it. There are of course no perfect solution, and the group that is kind of left out by my solution is that part of the heroic raiding player base that likes a little challenge that heroic so far provided. And ironically, of all the groups when it comes to raiding, I myself would probably mark myself as a part of this group. And for them perhaps, we could utilize more the challenge that Blizzard already makes for the glory of the Raider achievements. It's just now that they provide only the mount, but maybe we could make it so doing the boss in achievement mode style, so kind of a hard mode, which again Blizzard does make for every raid tier anyway, provides a more challenge, and maybe the reward for that will not be purely cosmetic, but maybe more dropped gear. Not better gear, just more in quantity instead of quality. And I do think heroic raiders would be just as fine doing normal raid, so faster and easier for the same or bigger rewards. I do believe removing heroic and increasing the rewards of normal wouldn't hurt them in any major way. I think a lot of them would even appreciate this kind of solution. And actually, same goes for the Mythic Raiders. It's actually a win for literally everyone, because Mythic Raiders have a much more faster and easier way to just farm the best gear to be prepared for Mythic progression. Add to it the little improvements like reducing the downtime of summoning and rebuffing eating and so on, and you have a very solid ground to make further improvements on. Like adding more rewards to the raid in general, because I think that is the issue in itself, that the rewards are just very scarce for raiding itself. I think a mount, let's say, for the Ahead of the Curve achievement should be for absolutely every raid tier at minimum. But that's just the side point. All the improvements to the raiding system in World of Warcraft you can think of are much easier implemented into the game when you have just basically two modes. The casual, the easier mode, the normal mode, which in itself drops very good gear, one of the best you can get in the game, just how it used to be. And then the hardcore mode, the one that's dedicated for the real challenge. The one you do for the challenge itself, where the gear is a mean to an end and not the end itself. And there are actually many more advantages to this solution than you might think at first. If we have like normal players and then a little bit better players, the heroic level players, when we squeeze them all together into a singular difficulty setting, which is normal, then the raid clears are just better and faster for everyone. It's also way easier to form a group, because now there is just one difficulty setting instead of two. Also, the item level will not go as high up every raid tier, because we just deleted a whole raid tier of item levels, so we can keep everything lower, and many more minor advantages. Now, you might have noticed that there is a difficulty setting of a raid that I kind of omitted in this video, and it's the raid finder, and that is for a reason. In short, I do think Raid Finder attracts a very different kind of a player than the other raid difficulties do, and that the existence of the Raid Finder isn't really that much intertwined with the other difficulties. I do think Raid Finder has its own issues, and I'd be happy to make a whole separate video about it, so let me know if you're interested. But for the purposes of this video, let's just say that I think Raid Finder should stay. I don't think we would accomplish anything by deleting it. Now, there is a certain category, let's call it, of problems that would come with my solution. But they're not really problems. I think the more proper way of looking at it is why Blizzard wouldn't implement the solution I am describing here if they were asked. It's the matter of character progression, which nowadays came back to just being the gear of our character once we got rid of the borrowed power systems. Now, that in itself is a topic for a whole different discussion, so I will just cut it short in here. If you look at the game design of WoW that revolves around raiding, one of the things you can notice is Blizzard's thinking of it all as a long-term gameplay, which spans throughout the months, throughout the season. And that is why normal and heroic are actually very intertwined. Blizzard's thinking of an average, say normal raiding guild seems to be like this. They progress the raid at their level, so be it normal. And then after a week and every week they get stronger because they get better and higher gear. So then with time, even when they clear normal, they still have something to do, because now with better gear they can start progressing heroic and so on and go further, so that they always have something to do, something to progress throughout the season, and you can go a level higher with that. Heroic raiding guild can have those first few or even more mythic bosses with time, with months, as people gear up. And the whole game and the gearing system and finally the raid design and structure revolves around it. Because if you look at it this way, this long-term thing where normal guild shifts to heroic and so on, that everyone has something to like do, some challenge to overcome, something to achieve for the whole 6 months of a season, it kind of makes sense that you would design the raid structure and the rewards to be stretched out in time. So in other words, you have to put more time investment to reap the full benefits, the full rewards. And that very reasoning is the root of the problem. And with that kind of thinking, it actually suddenly makes sense to make normal and heroic so unrewarding, so that you are incentivized to go up a level with time. And that like progression mindset seems to be Blizzard's thinking here. Designing a game at that level so that it spans throughout months and the reward structure built to function for months worth of gameplay is fundamentally flawed, because an average player who raids at normal and to a large degree heroic level doesn't think like that. It does, however, work for a Mythic raider, this progression long-term mindset. But an average player who would consider doing a normal raid does not look at normal raiding as this like, you know, oh, I'm gonna raid throughout several months, I'm gonna progress this raid every week for several months. No, because by the very definition of being a casual gamer, he looks for it to be like a content to just do, maybe several times, but absolutely not this long-term investment. So, simplifying it, if you make a reward structure that spans throughout the months, that means for this like average normal casual player that in fact there is no reward for him, because he's not gonna be playing throughout those months. So that means there is no reward for him, so there is no reason for him to do the raid. And my solution kind of breaks this whole thinking, because one of the side effects that deleting heroic and upping the rewards of a normal raid by a large margin would have is that players would gear insanely faster. And I think Blizzard is kind of afraid of that. Blizzard is kind of afraid of a situation when a player just achieves this goal and says, okay, I have nothing to do for this season, I can just take a break. And that very thing, by the way, is exactly what happened in Dragonflight Season 2 when it comes to Mythic Plus, because of the new gear progression system. It was very fast, you could gear very fast, so what it meant long term is that less people played in the later months of the season, because there was no reason to. So think about it, if you make the game rewarding, which is basically what we want, we get gear faster, so that means that in later time of the season less people are playing and it's harder to form a group for people who just now started playing. Also the money from the subs, right? So I actually do think that there was some reasoning, there was some so to speak justification for Blizzard to make this system to look like this, so that you basically just need to play longer to get the full rewards. But here comes the brutal fucking truth. In today's day and age, you cannot design a game for a casual player so that the gameplay and its rewards are like stretched throughout months. Because he's not gonna invest that kind of time in that because he's a casual. Instead, he just says, fuck it, I'm out. It's not worth my time. And that's it. It's just that simple. He just goes to play other games that feel rewarding and don't waste his time. So even though making the raid more rewarding in less time and effort would have the side effect of people dropping the content in later months of the season, or perhaps even subs to pay, but the truth is you have to do it, you have to change it, you have to make it more rewarding, because if you don't, people are just going to quit raiding at all with time, which is exactly what happens now and has happened throughout the years and will keep on happening as long as this system looks like this. But hey, there is hope. There is a light in the tunnel. Because if you think about it, what I'm describing, the thinking that Blizzard has had, was actually the reason for many other things, like the borrowed power systems and many other that Blizzard got rid of. The root of the problem there was actually the same, forcing people to play with time so that the numbers will not drop off. Hence the grinds, for example. The artifact power, remember that? So I think Dragonflight proved that Blizzard is willing to make such fundamental changes. So maybe, just maybe, we can change it the same way with the raiding itself. Holy fuck, that's a long video. I'm very sorry for that, and I thank you very much if you stick to the end. Believe it or not, I actually deleted some parts of the video about methodology and such things, so that it's not like an hour long. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you guys think.